So welcome everyone, and thanks for being here today for this first event of the CLACS faculty series. So the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at Brown also hosts several affiliated faculty from other departments, and we are very happy today to start this series with Professor Jill Kuhnheim and from Hispanic Studies. So Jill will be the first one today to host this new event that we are organizing for the first time in 2021. I will quickly read Jill's rich bio, and then I will ask her to start with her talk for around 30 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A following a presentation in which you in the audience will be able to submit your questions via the Q&A tool in the webinar menu. So Jill Kuhnheim, a visiting professor in Hispanic Studies at Brown University, has been a tenured professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Kansas. Her areas of interest include contemporary Latin American literatures, particularly poetry, gender and feminist studies, and healthcare humanities in a Latin American context. Her most recent books include Teaching Modern Latin American Poetries, MLA Press 2019, co-edited with Melanie Nicholson, and Para Vivir con Salud, Leyendo la salud y la literatura, an open access educational web book co-authored with Kathryn McKnight. So thanks for joining us, and Jill, please move forward with your presentation entitled Questions about Transdisciplinary Pedagogy, Ideas and Practices.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Thanks also to Patsy for the invitation and to Kate for her help setting this up. Since I was not teaching last year, I am not as far ahead as my colleagues in doing everything virtually. So I appreciate the assistance. So as Erica mentioned, my fields of research throughout my career has mostly been contemporary Latin American literatures and particularly poetry. But today I thought I'd talk a bit about how I've broadened these fields and made some perhaps unexpected connections in my teaching. So questions about transdisciplinary pedagogy, ideas and practices. Questions is the first word of my title, and it's also my first link to pedagogy. You see, I believe in the adage that the best teachers don't teach the answers, but teach their students how to ask the right questions for the answers change. Asking the right questions is more difficult than it may sound when teaching the literatures, languages and cultures of Latin America to a group of students largely not from the region, however. One may ask graduate students, what do we need to know to understand this work? And they have places to start, footholds. They might pool their knowledge to begin to ask the right questions. But undergraduate outsiders to the cultures, literatures, and histories of the region, maybe to the concept of culture and literature themselves, often don't know where to begin. What do we need to know about Colombia in order to understand Garcia Marquez? This is a more difficult question than it may seem, which is why teaching literature always involves teaching culture and history. For literature is not simply a reflection of these, but a construction of them. Today, I'm going to offer you a couple of examples from my pedagogical experiences to look at some of the effects of a transdisciplinary cultural studies approach to the teaching of both literatures and cultures. One of the first is the problematization of all terms, of what is literature and how it has been constructed relative to the idea of Latin America, of how what counts as literature has changed and how it might shift in the future. This leads us to examine the political implications of what officially matters as literature or culture and the shifting boundaries between high, popular, and mass cultures. In Hispanic Studies, we teach classes in literature and classes in culture, but the boundaries between them are elastic, and the differences in these classes is one of degree, not kind. Like literature, the teaching of culture has changed. Cultural studies self-examination does not allow students to consume culture as tourists, accumulating a portfolio of cultural monuments or artifacts, but pushes all of us to question the construction of these cultural objects. This questioning urges us outward in turn to probe the nature of representation and power in societies, Latin American and North American, to investigate individual, national, and regional identities. My colleagues and I work with an expanded notion of literature and textuality and try to push our reading outside of Occidental boundaries and biases, not just when approaching colonial texts or cultural relics, but contemporary ones as well. Since we're questioning our assumptions about literature and culture, the idea of Latin America itself begins to unravel, for it too has a history. A transdisciplinary approach to the cultures and literatures of the region uncovers links between geography and institutional power and interrogates the concept of Latin America, its unities and differences, where the term comes from, how it is used, when, and by whom. As Ramon de la Campa urges, when we teach, we must examine, and I quote, what sort of academic object we construct, and remind our students of the specificity of different Latin American societies and histories, as well as their commonalities. There is no regional, cultural, or literary essence, but, to paraphrase Campa again, a set of complex living cultures with many other forms of discourse and politics. Setting aside these theoretical speculations about teaching Latin America, I want to move to a concrete example of how I've put the concept of Latin America's complex living cultures into play in a cultural studies class in which literature is one element among many others. When I've taught this upper level undergraduate course, I've structured it around distinct themes: sports and melodrama, mestizo and indigenous identities, tourism and contemporary urban cultures. These themes are complemented by critical essays about issues such as high and popular culture, cultural resistances and aesthetics, the consumption of culture by writings about the potato as cultural metaphor, El laberinto de la soledad, ecoturismo, and late 20th century megacities. And I incorporate poetry into several different sections in perhaps unexpected ways. I'll only take time today to give you an overview of the first part of the class, which will lead to a specific example of how one group of students perceived national identities as represented in the telenovela El Pecalaleo Yuki. We begin the class discussing football through essays by Eduardo Archetti, who opposes Argentine to British playing styles and examines the construction of various masculinities in the sport. Some of these same themes continue in Eduardo Galeano's romantic vision of the sport in Football a Sol y Sombra, which contrasts with Chilean Pedro Lemever's political view of hinchas de fútbol, or football hooligans, and their roles in politics. Lenin in El Fútbol, a short story by Mexican Guillermo Samperio, tempers romantic with economic aspects of the sport and moves us from the Southern Cone to Mexico. This gives me a transition to another sport, Lucha Libre, and we read essays about it by Heather Levy, José Joaquín Blanco, and Jesus Martín Barbero, and discover its connection to melodrama, the popular, and see its political transformation or adaptation by figures such as Super Barrio. Melodrama and its popular audiences make a coherent link to the telenovela, the next cultural form we consider in the course. I'm not a particular fan of soap operas, nor is it my main area of research, but sometimes it's refreshing to choose a topic in which students can share their expertise. A good number of my students are always soap opera aficionados, and they can use their cultural knowledge in this segment of the course, as usually others have already done with the football and the lucha libre. When thinking about the telenovela, students do not simply examine another manifestation of soap opera relative to the ones they know, but learn to analyze the cultural products with which they are most familiar, to make contrasts and think about how the audience is positioned or interpolated, to slip back into theory for a moment, among other questions. Let's see, I've used different examples of soap operas from diverse countries with contrasting styles. Yo Soy Betty La Fea is an obvious example, or Simplemente Maria from Peru. It was first shown in the 1960s and had enormous social consequences, increasing in interest in sewing and also in literacy. And then there's Nicaragua's Sexto Sentido from the early 2000s, which deals with adolescent social issues in a compelling way. But my example today comes from El Pecalaleo Yuki, which raises some particularly intriguing cultural questions, as we'll see. This series, produced for Televisa in Mexico in 1985, tells the story of Oyuki, a Japanese geisha. At the beginning of the series, Oyuki has a falling out with her older brother, then meets and falls in love with English painter Irving, whom she marries against both families' wishes. Their lives go on with typical twists and turns, but you get the idea. This was the first Mexican telenovela to choose such an exotic topic and location. It was filmed in the backlots in Mexico and on location in Japan, and it was enormously popular. It is billed as uno de las grandes superproducciones de Televisa on one of its websites, and this over-the-top production may add to its glamour and allure. One doesn't have to know the story to understand the major tensions in the episode I show, and I do not give any background on the narrative before I show it. I do give the title, date of production, and origin, and also mention that this particular section was recorded for me by a former student from Univision in Chicago in the 1990s. So you already know more than my students would. When I first taught this course at UW-Madison, in discussion following the episodes we viewed, students revealed that while they understood that the marriage between Oyuki and Irving was not supported by their parents, they didn't know why. While Oyuki was obviously Japanese in appearance, stereotypically so in makeup, gesture, and costume, they wondered why she spoke Spanish without an accent. But they didn't see the cultural markers that indicate that Irving is British. They discussed whether he might be Chilean, though, because he didn't fit with some of their preconceptions about what Mexicans look like. And they didn't know if the story took place in Mexico or Japan. I found their difficulties in pinpointing national identities unexpected and fascinating. It turns out that since everyone was speaking Spanish, an accent which some could identify, to my students, these were Mexican. They heard the surface representation as Mexican, and at times didn't see what the actors were representing. This led to a discussion about how in many North American films and television shows, the actors do not speak languages other than English, often do not even use accented English to represent otherness, or they do so unevenly. We observed that Russianness, for example, could be conveyed by snowy climbs, Cossack coats, and fur hats in Hollywood, and a North American audience would see these markers and understand Russian as long as the language was transparent. If they spoke Spanish, though, it was clear that it would be difficult for many of my students to perceive them as Russians. One little aside about Oyuki that's kind of interesting, the main actress, Ana Martin, there's gossip about how she had to have some plastic surgery after playing the role for so long because the makeup was so hard on her face. El Pecalaleo Yuki may be its stereotypical depictions of Japanese life, but at the same time, it presents provocative possibilities for analyzing how national identities are constructed and represented and how they are perceived. From the series and our reactions to it, we learn how audiences may see different things in the same cultural product, the attraction of a foreign setting in Mexico and its twofold strangeness when viewing this with students in Wisconsin. These responses make us realize how we're situated as cultural consumers and as analysts, and help us to recognize that the critic or reader is always positioned to see some things and not others. I encouraged my students to think about why El Pecalaleo Yuki had been so popular in Mexico. What did this plot have in common with other telenovela plots, the definition of melodrama and its appeal, and what was different? This brings us to the idea of the exotic. What is exotic and to whom? I pointed out that there are different audiences for soap opera in Latin America. It is not a women's genre, for it is shown at night and draws a large audience of men. It's interesting, in fact, to keep the commercials in the viewing of these novelas and examine what they tell us about the expected audiences. These economic issues lead us to discuss how this genre is a primary source for local stars in emergent film industries in countries where there is no Hollywood. We debate how the specific issues raised by El Pecalaleo Yuki might be pertinent to Mexican viewers: cross-cultural, racial, class, religious marriages, bicultural children, and may be relative to Mexico's long history of mestizaje. And if we get into the institutionalization of mestizaje, the issue can get really complex. Thinking about where I first obtained my copy of a capítulo, and this was before so much was easily accessed on the internet, we wonder if the series might have been even more salient to viewers in Chicago, living on the hyphen, those who maintain another culture within the dominant Anglo one and are even more in danger of losing their children to otherness. With these kinds of observations, students begin to realize that culture is an environment, a process, and a hegemony, to quote a snippet of Edward Said, in which we as individuals are embedded. I see this classroom conversation as one small step in the process of creating a double vision in my students, an ability to see the world and themselves through their own eyes and those of an other, which is one of my goals in teaching Latin American literatures and cultures in the United States. This concept comes from the work of African Americans, Manning Marable and Toni Morrison, among others, who have theorized about how minority populations have to develop a double perspective, for they see events themselves in their lives, first through their own eyes, and then see again through the eyes of the dominant culture, a dominant culture in which they may be paradoxically unseen and hyper-visible. I want to move students of Latin American cultures towards this double vision, to see beyond their customary world, to look back at their reality and question it from another perspective, from another position, creating hybrid identifications. In this way, they develop a critical consciousness, which Said defines as an unstoppable predilection for alternatives. I love that expression, an unstoppable predilection for alternatives. This perspective aims to produce an ongoing desire to ask questions about where I, you, they, we came from, where we all might be going, and with whom. So I'll close today telling you briefly about a bigger shift that arose from similar pedagogical intentions to open transdisciplinary conversations, this time to connect with the humanities to healthcare in Spanish-speaking contexts. When I was at KU, students wanted a course in Spanish for the healthcare professionals, and though this was way outside my research agenda at the time, I was directing the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies, and my partner worked in public health at the med school. So I had connections to folks who worked in healthcare from a variety of perspectives. So I said, okay, I can work on that. When I arrived at Brown, no one in Hispanic Studies here was teaching in this area, and it has become my thing. So I teach an intermediate class and developed a more advanced health, illness, and medicine in Spanish American literature and film that we offer to students with interests in public health, medicine, and other issues related to well-being in the Spanish-speaking communities. Like my students who bring their varied training in other disciplines to literature, I use my background to dialogue with healthcare issues and create a mutually productive discussion and another way to bring our knowledge into the world. And rather than give you an overview of these classes, I'll just tell you a little about how I've come to connect my interest in poetry with healthcare and how it's changed my research as well as my teaching. There are many possible uses for poetry in a healthcare context. For clinicians, it may augment their ability to communicate, and literature's irreducibility may improve their capacity to recognize multiple, often contradictory meanings, or stated more broadly, to handle uncertainty. In her article, Anecdotal Evidence, What Patient Poets Provide, Marilyn McIntyre notes that, and I quote her here, good poetry with its ruptured syntax, surprising images, intuitive leaps, and unlikely associations can be an instrument of healing and a source of unique, usable information for both patient and caregiver, end of quote. The particularity of poetic expression trains us to pay attention, to notice how things are said or not said, a focus that may offer clues to feelings or reactions that may otherwise be missed. McIntyre observes how line length can create visual patterns of advance and retreat, giving loss or pain a shape and a story, and offering patients an exercise of choice and I quote her again, in those inexorable, inescapable situations of illness where choices seem drastically diminished, end of quote. Poetic expression, written and read, may challenge the tendency to oversimplify pain. Lyric poetry puts feelings first. It may complicate or intensify these through sound, syntax, word choice, lines, stanza shapes, references, or images. It may tell a story or resist any storytelling, and its difficulty may create meaning by indicating indirectly what it works against. Susan Sontag and others have reflected on how language shapes our experiences of illness. Honing in on poetry, McIntyre observes, quoting her again, how a startling image, a counterintuitive line break, an unusual verb choice, a repetition of sound, or even an antique meter can call our attention to a facet of experience we might have overlooked or trivialized, end of quote. Paraphrasing Stephanie Burt, poetry may take us many emotional places, to many parts of history or the world, but how we read poetry or where a line takes us also depends on where we want to go. Since illness makes our life experiences strange, perhaps it is appropriate to express this in language made strange. I don't know if you remember, language made strange is one of the sayings that come out of the Russian formalists, one of their definitions of poetry. So employing varied means of communication makes us adjust our focus to see health from distinct angles that produce different knowledge about a range of living and dying experiences. It is not incidental that these experiences are frequently conveyed through lyric poetry, for the genre is, and I quote here, Rafael Campo, who is a Cuban-American poet and physician. He says, the genre is flexible enough to be transformed by the experience it represents. Just as, in a comparable way, our understandings of what poetry is and does is continually altered and enriched by expanding the contexts, issues, disciplines, and technologies with which we approach the genre. So I'm going to close with that thought, hoping that some of these connections between literature and other fields may lead you to ask questions about where you might go next in your research and teaching. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean. This was a very stimulating and insightful presentation. I'm sure that many of the colleagues that are attending this talk today will find themselves very comfortable, somehow at home in this approach that you have described. Those of us who come from literary studies and have somehow stretched literature into other fields of knowledge in our research and in our teaching for different reasons, and many times in order to somehow respond to students' expectations and requests, as it was your case. So thanks for sharing your personal experience with us, and also somehow the challenges that you have encountered while somehow moving, but not completely, somehow bridging from literature into public health and health sciences. So as I said, I will encourage everyone in the audience to submit the questions via the Q&A, and I will start with myself with a question, since you opened your presentation by saying that you prefer to teach how to ask rather than how to rather than providing responses to students, so how to ask the right questions. And you started with a question which is, for which you didn't provide any response, which is, what do we need to know about Colombia to understand Gabriel Garcia Marquez? So I'm very curious about this question that you formulated at the beginning, somehow that combines literature, cultural studies, and the general understanding of a country and of Latin America as a whole. So what do we need to know about Colombia when we teach Gabriel Garcia Marquez? I mean, when we want students to learn about Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the same question about Mexico when we when we study Fuentes, or Argentina when we study Borges, to go back to poetry, which is your main entry?
Well, Erica, I know you teach too, and it seems like we always start giving background. I mean, one of my experiments is not to give so much background and see what happens when we don't know certain things, because as soon as we set up a background of information, we're setting up ways of reading, ways of understanding. And sometimes it's interesting to sort of leave that for later. For example, sometimes when I teach poetry, I start with a Cuban poem, and I don't give any information about where it's from or anything. We just start reading the poem, and I see what students say. And sometimes I get students who are from the Caribe who know right away. They hear things and they say, "Oh, we know this poem is from Cuba," or "We know this poem." We can hear it, and they can tell other students, which is always a great thing. And then we sort of work from the work back to the context. But in other cases, I mean, I have very seldom started to teach something without giving at least some kind of background. I mean, temporal background. You need to know the place, what's happening politically. It's hard to understand a lot of things without having all of that background material. But I don't like to overload it at first. I like to let the students see what comes out of the text and then have them go and find the information that they need in order to understand what's going on. I think it's much more productive in the long run than giving a long rollo at the beginning of the class about how things have been understood. Though, again, I would do it differently at different levels, depending on where we are and what the purpose of the class is. So, and I often learn a lot from students' reactions to things. Sometimes I learn things about generational differences, what students see now that they didn't see 10 years ago, how they read differently now. Sometimes it's the makeup of the class, who you have and what kinds of experiences they bring to the class. One of the last seminars I taught in Kansas was called Reading Latin Americanism. And I had a lot of students from different departments because I was involved in Latin American Caribbean studies. And what was really cool about it is we had a lot of conversation. One of the things, we actually went back and read Cien Años de Soledad, which I have to tell you, I hadn't read since I was in college. So I reread it, but we started off talking about when we'd all first read the book. And some people, of course, had read it in high school and they hated it and so on. And so we all had different experiences of reading that we brought back in order to, what does it mean rereading it now when we're both farther along in our literary development, personal development, when so much time has passed since it hit became news. So.
Yeah, so I think that what is very challenging, right, in the kind of courses that we teach, I see that Laura Bass is here, Leila and Jeremy Lenner here, like in the Hispanic Studies department, Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, same year CLACS, and I'm sure if there were colleagues from other departments related to literary study, it will be the same. Is like the question, or how do we create somehow this relationship with the text for students? I think that this is the most challenging part of our job. Somehow, our students are readers. They are readers have been readers for many years, and they consume a lot of readings because of their courses. But then, obviously, the approach to a literary text, or even more to poetry, doesn't require somehow the same kind of reading, the same kind of really intimate reading that another kind of text. Think about essays from social science, or maybe essays from public health, and you can tell us more about the kind of difference that you see when it comes to read, like a literary text versus a text from another field, mainly public health. So what are the challenges that you encounter in creating somehow this close relationship with the text that will bring to an authentic close reading of the text?
Well, let me tell one of the things, I mean, of course, again, everything varies depending on level your teaching and the experience of your readers, but I have been surprised in my career over the years at the number of graduate students who have said to me when they're starting a class, sometimes a class I've taught that was focused on poetry, and they said, I really don't like poetry. And they tell me that right up front, you know, sometimes even with more vehemence. And one of my arguments to them has always been, you don't have to like it, but you have to know how to read it. So, you know, hopefully we'll move to that by the time you're finished with this class. But one of the reasons they don't like it is because of the way it's been taught to them before, because they don't have the experience reading it, or they don't feel able to read it in a way that is comprehensive. And that has to do with knowing cultural references. Sometimes it has to do with the way poetry is set up, and people start talking too much from the beginning about technical aspects, and they don't really, so it's often good to start a class with, what did you get out of this reading? What is your most basic reaction to it? Sort of a fundamental, and often I have to talk students into telling me the most basic thing. You know, this poem is about a conversation between these two guys and nothing happens. I mean, if I can get them to say that, that's often what I want them to start with, is that they could understand what was happening. Then we start building a context around it, which is always what happens when you teach. What's interesting about teaching in the medical, I get students who are interested in medicine. They have their own set of expectations about what it is we're doing. And sometimes they bring different frames of references to what we've read. So they write reactions to the reading, and they're using a framework that is a medical framework that isn't one that I use, but it really works for reading that particular text. I have specific examples, but I can't remember what the medical terms are right now. But anyway, so we're trading back and forth. I'm doing the literary thing in a medical context. They're doing a medical thing with literature, and we have this dialogue, and it really has been fun. So I put in my last slide, I have a paper that's out on poetry and migraine that I wrote as a result of doing this work. And I have one coming out now called Imaginative Medicine, Thinking Creatively About Poetry, Illness, and Pain. That's about what it sounds like. It's about a Mexican poet and a North American poet, and they're writing about illness and pain. And again, it's about how poetry can reveal certain things about people's experiences. Sometimes it builds solidarity in a group of people who are suffering a chronic illness and are isolated. And for example, migraine sufferers don't always talk about it. A lot of migraine literature is visual literature, but because of the auras that people experience, that part of my argument there is that it's a non-narrative experience. Often it's not a storytelling experience. So this kind of fragmentation that can happen in poetry, it opens itself to the migraine experience. So those are some of the different ways that teaching has changed how I see things and how I hope my students see things.
Great, Jill. So I think there is a comment from Patsy.
Hi, Jill.
Hi.
Erica, thanks for this really interesting presentation. I don't have a question. I just wanted to jump in, following on Erica's question to you. And to just say that coming from the political sciences, how and not being used generally to using literature in teaching and introducing it more tentatively in recent times, how powerful it has been. I find that literature has a way of making the emotional connections that students respond to far more effectively than, giving them the historical context or the, political context or the economic context. And even when it's not literature itself, but it's observations about life from a literary figure, that seems that with all the statistics and the research frameworks, that's, it seems to have more of a resonance with students. And the example that always never ceases to amaze me is how many of our students know Jamaica Kincaid's In a Small Place. It doesn't matter what the topic is, if environmental degradation, the ills of tourism, the problems of trying to create an economy in a small place, in a small country. they immediately say, yes, Jamaica kinkied. And so many of the problems, and this is mostly a tirade against, everything she sees that is wrong in her society. But they respond to that emotionally. I remember also using a poem in talking about hurricanes in the Caribbean and looking at Hurricane Maria. And this poet is, his grandmother is responding to hurricane she experienced as a child. And it just so gives the picture of intergenerational trauma, the fact that this is nothing new, that, there is a long history of these things. So I just want to say that I tend to feel very tentative about using literature, but ultimately I find it really enriches whatever it is you're doing. And I just wanted to thank you for, for upfronting the importance and value of literature as an educational tool. Thank you.
Thanks, Patsy. The other thing I was actually thinking about, even while I was writing this, was it's the time of year where graduate students who are on the job market often send me their teaching philosophies, which a lot of places they have to submit a teaching philosophy. And a lot of times they concentrate, as would be natural, on the kinds of things that they've taught and what they've had, but they haven't got sort of the bigger picture about why it's important, what it is the big global picture about literature or the particular kind of literature that they're dealing with, and that there are different ways to conceptualize why we teach what we teach and what are the values of it, and that specific examples from your experience are often ways to enliven your teaching statement when you have to go and write that kind of document.
Sorry, I was following you and then I didn't see the questions here. So yeah, they are. We have a question from Kristen Collins, our postdoc Sawyer Mellon this year at CLACS. Thanks for sharing such interesting work. I wanted to know a little bit more about your thoughts on pleasure in the classroom. You mentioned students not liking poetry and bringing in their own viewing practices of telenovelas. I would love to know more about how taking pleasure or not in reading plays, how taking pleasure or not in reading plays a role in your pedagogy.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about that cultural studies class is that I have such a variety of stuff in there that it's got to have some part that appeals to everybody. Sometimes people will not like this part, but then they'll get to another part and they do that. So when I'm throwing poetry in there, they don't notice it very much because it's not a class focused on poetry, for example. So if they have that hostility from having had bad experiences, they don't show it as much. So one way to get more students in is to do a lot of variety in your classes, to get people interested in your area, because you give them a lot of ways to like different things. Not everybody's going to like everything. One hopes that as the understanding increases and the conversations in class become interesting, that people will get more engaged with it. I mean, there are people who are very scornful of telenovelas and others who don't know why we're talking about soccer. Sometimes I have, when I do the football section as well as reading, I usually have a couple of graduate students come from different countries and talk about soccer and their families, to give that visceral reaction to what it is to be a fan of a particular team, and that can make it really real for people. I mean, how to connect those things to their lives. So in that class, it's easy, for example, to fold the poetry in because I have other things that I'm doing. The healthcare classes, we read a lot of different material. Lots of it is narrative and stories. Some of it is medical anthropology. Some of it is like memoirs or people's, and we read a novel that has to do with AIDS, but it's never named in the novel. But I put poetry in there at different moments and talk about how it works differently for different people. Rafael Campo, for example, the person I quoted there at the end, the Cuban-American physician poet, has a wonderful TED talk on this if you want to Google him. He's great about poetry and medicine, what it does for him as a physician, and how he understands patients often through their reading poetry together. So people start to, he has the authority of being a physician that I am not. So, you know, I find a way to link to my students who often want to work in the medical field, and see how it might be useful to them. And some students automatically come and they click into it, and other students not quite so. It's a longer process. But part of what I'm trying to tell you is that I think drawing on the student's own experience is part of what, if I get ways to make them see that they've got some of the tools to understand this without the heavy theoretical framework, or all of the language that we use to analyze poetry. We don't have to start off with that. They can still understand what's going on, and then we work up towards getting more technical.
Thanks, Jill. So we have another question from Laura Bass. Thanks, Jill, for sharing your wisdom and experience. Going back to the question of the initial resistance to poetry, typical among students who will say it's too hard, I'm not good at it. Do you find that you are able to get them over time to see how the literary elements convey their meaning and effective charge? So are you successful in this?
Yes. Yeah, I am. I mean, again, if I'm teaching a class, when I first started teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, the first class I taught the first class didn't have poetry as its concentration, but the first class I taught, I think I taught a graduate class at the end of my first year, that they asked me to do a focus on poetry, and I didn't have very many students. That meant at the University of Wisconsin, I had 8, which is a big class here at Brown, but it was a tiny class at Wisconsin, a graduate class, because we ran graduate classes that were quite big. But by the time I finished, I had a class on poetry and postmodernismo, and that was the topic. And I had 15 students easily, because people knew me and knew I wasn't going to pound them over the head with the difficult parts of poetry to start with. I was easing them into it, so that what I do is find ways, teach a variety of things so that people find which one they connect with. And then we work up to reading things in a more technical level. Sometimes the analogy I use is that every discipline has its language. For example, with astronomy, you don't call a planet a star, and so on. Everything is different. And once we get to starting to identify what's happening, you want to have language to be able to specify what it is you're seeing. So you need to know the differences and to think about, for example, who's talking and what the perspective is in the poem. What does that mean? And what do we learn about the person because of that perspective? I've found that I can usually get students to, they may not choose it as their discipline, but they understand how to teach poetry and what to do with it, whether they read it in the future is their business.
Thanks for doing that, Jill, and for continuing to do it. So I have myself 2 other questions that I would like to ask you, but it's like more out of curiosity. So one of them is about, obviously, like we are in a time of pandemic still, and how did the pandemic maybe modify or nuance it, I don't know, your perception and in preparing courses and in teaching about this connection between public health and illness, death, and literature. Now I think we're not, like, particularly like young people and students have been experiencing deaths around them. That was like part of our daily life and is still. So is there anything that you have changed in your courses, maybe to incorporate also these recent times? This is my first question. Maybe we can start with this question because the other one is a bit different.
Well, the course I'm teaching right now is the Spanish for Healthcare Professionals. It's an intermediate level course. So we don't read a lot of heavy duty literature there, but I do have a little, I include there's some poetry about COVID. So people do write about, we read some poems that are cardio poems also that are about people's, having cardiac problems. So there is writing about COVID. Again, we read articles about all kinds of issues there. I mean, we don't just read literary articles. We do some medical anthropology. Again, we read about something called the Hispanic paradox about health in the United States. The only difference I can see coming back this year in my students, I would say there are more students are much more conscious of public health than they were before the pandemic, of what public health is and the importance of public health. Before at Brown in the last 5 years, a lot of students here, were very focused on being doctors, on getting their, some of them are in the PLEMI program, which lets them go right into medical school. I think people are broadening their perspective to think about health in a variety of ways, which is also one of the things I see as one of the goals of that course, particularly the intermediate course. I invite speakers from the School of Public Health to come and talk, because lots of people in the School of Public Health are not MDs. They study healthcare economics. There are people who study Maricruz Hernandez, for example, is gerontology, which she has a PhD in, which is a combination of sociology, anthropology, and economics for her. And she comes and talks about how she got there. So we talk about a lot of different ways, different things you can do with healthcare. And we talk about it in an international context as well as with Hispanics in the United States. So that has less to do with literature and more to do with being flexible. And in that class, I'm not so much, my focus is not getting students to go into different genres, but to show them how literature can open up their thinking about medicine and perhaps help them to deal with situations they're going to have to confront in the future, especially situations like end of life, reading about end of life decisions. We talk about controversial things like abortion as well.
Oh,
second question?
No, my second question is like more, maybe a personal question. Of course, personal question coming from my own, my own questions in terms of reading. Do you have like a constellation of authors, or can be novelists or can be poets, that are like your somehow fetishist authors, in terms like the ones that you consider somehow the most related to this crossed interdisciplinary approach that is yours, like public health and literature? Meaning, are there authors that will bring in somehow more like these health issues, illness and diseases among the ones that you have explored over your career? Like, can you name some of them?
Yeah, well, one of them, I'm sure, is Julio Cortázar. Mm-hmm. Julio Cortázar has a story that people don't read as much as some of his others called La Señorita Cora. Señorita Cora is a nurse, and so it's an interesting story for that reason. Then there's the La Salud de los Enfermos by Cortázar, which that one is more read. It appears in more collections, but that one has to do with a mother who's ill and how a family confronts her illness. So it's about kind of truth telling and protecting people from illness and death in that case. What's interesting is when I teach these stories, I teach them a little differently than I would teach them if I'm just teaching a literature class. So for example, even we read, in my intermediate class, we read Un Día de Estos. If you remember, that's the short story by Garcia Marquez with the dentist who has to, the mayor comes in and has a toothache, and he asks the dentist to pull his tooth, but the mayor's, from the military government, and the dentist is on the opposite side. So there's a whole political thing going on there, but it also is about a medical experience. So while you have to talk about the political issues because it's right there in front of you, and that's the normal way I would have taught that story, and about how it's communicated or what's not communicated, all of those things stay the same. But I add now issues about what is the doctor's responsibility in terms of providing healthcare. How is healthcare affected by politics, which is of course incredibly relevant. And sometimes people bring experiences to that, but those are two authors. Roberto Bolaño has a story about healthcare, about his experience with cancer, and it's a wild sort of Bolaño. It's not long.
So what about poetry?
What poetry do I include? Oh, well, some of the poetry I include, for example, I include the book that I wrote about in the migraine papers, Emicrania by Claudia Hernández del Valle Arispe, una mexicana. I include some of her poems about migraine. We talk about, I'm basically using my argument that I then turned into the paper about poetry, about migraine being a non-narrative experience. I use shorter poems. I'm trying to think if I've used any really famous people's poems that you would know. Well, Neruda has poems. I use some Neruda. He has Oda Lavatorista. Mm-hmm. He has some of his odes have to do with poetry. And then there's this whole, Neruda's first child had encephaly, and he has a poem about that indirectly, and we talk about that. So I'm reading the poems sometimes more biographically than I would read them in that case in a different kind of context. We're still reading the poems and we're talking about the images and the kinds of accumulation of ways he communicates about what's happening, but we're also talking about the healthcare issues behind some of the poets. So those are some that come to mind that are easy to find. There are other works that I use that are longer, but.
Well, thanks for sharing this with us. And if I may, I would suggest, since you're interested in this migraine, problem and how it comes to be expressed in a language, either in fiction or poetry, you may certainly know. I was reading it recently, and I'm very proud that I was able to finish this novel because it was very complicated to read in terms of, very demanding. Uh-huh. Mariana Enriquez, the Argentinian novelist, she's been very successful at the moment. And this is her first novel because she mainly wrote short stories, and it's Nuestra Parte de Noche. So it's a 700-page novel, and it's a very complex story of a family of medium mm-hmm. During the dictatorship in Argentina, and there are, the father is sick with different earth issues and cardiac risk. And she goes very deep into details related to surgery and pain and different level of pain and different level of illness. And the kid of this character is the main character, and the father is trying to keep him very distant from all the supernatural visions that he has. Is constantly experiencing very strong migraines. Mm-hmm. I think you will find there a lot of material, for your research. This is in fiction, but she touches many times really quality of writing that is very close to poetry. Uh-huh. So hopefully, you will include her in your constellation of.
I don't think I would be able to teach the novel because it sounds too long. But
not the entire novel. Some excerpts.
I could pull excerpts, yeah.
Of migraine, in which this kid basically sees black flowers all over itself, and black flowers like spread in the sky, in the blue sky. Yeah. Different kind of visions of this kind.
I'm thinking, of course, I use Borges. Sobre la Segura. He writes on his blindness. He has some poetries that deal with it. I use Alejandra Pizarnik mm-hmm. to talk about depression and anxiety.
Absolutely,
I teach Rosario Castellanos, Volume 10, And we talk about anxiety through that poem.
And I guess that part of the literature could also be all literature related to torture, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, torture scene. And I don't know if you also work on post-traumatic experiences, so this is another level of research.
Yeah, no, I use, what's her name, Elaine, the one who writes the book about pain. Oh, I'm not remembering her name. She's writing about torture. Oh, golly, her last name is not coming to me, but I use some of her ideas about pain in some of the work I've done on pain, but I'm not talking about torture specifically there, but yeah.
Okay, maybe, I don't know, since this is the first time, I'm talking more to Patsy now, since this is the first event that we have in the context of the faculty series, Patsy, what could be nice, it could be maybe to share, you know, with the audience at the before or after the talk itself, maybe a selected bibliography of the professor, of the colleague who is sharing the research. What do you think? Maybe something we can consider.
Well, let me know what you decide.
Yeah, we can. Right now, you've caught me on the spot, but I know we're having a colleague in November. We're having our cohort visiting professors speak on October the 18th. We have a colleague who is in Hispanic Studies, who is Erica, I'm sorry, Kate, if you remember the exact time, you can chime in. And we have some talk scheduled for the spring. But what we can do is to put this together on our website as a distinct series of events so that people can access them.
So Jill will be very happy to receive somehow a selected bibliography, you know, of your main contributions to the field so that we can continue to read and know more about what you do and the work in progress as well.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay.
So thanks everyone. Thanks Patsy and Kate for having the idea of organizing this new series and for making it possible. Thanks Jill for sharing your career, research and teaching. And thanks to our audience for being here today and for your questions and for joining us. Hopefully you will continue to be joining us in the future events in the context of this series and beyond.
And thank you, Erica, for anchoring so
Sure.
ably this first discussion. And thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Gracias a todos. Hasta pronto.
Hasta pronto. Ciao, ciao.